In the late 8th century, when Europe was still half asleep, covered in fog, and smelled mostly of wet wool, a group of people from Scandinavia decided they were bored. These people were the Vikings, tall, loud, adventurous, and not particularly good at indoor voices. For generations, they had been farmers, fishermen, and occasional berserkers. Life was simple. Wake up, eat fish, yell at the weather, repeat. But eventually, someone asked a dangerous question. What's on the other side of the water? And that was it. Curiosity, greed, and the world's worst sense of direction launched one of history's most famous invasions. The Vikings were not known for meticulous planning. Their strategy meetings usually went like this. We should go west. There's gold there. Who told you that? A drunk man in the tavern. He seemed reliable. And that's how a handful of longships set sail from Norway toward what they thought was a land full of riches, opportunity, and people who wouldn't mind being robbed. The journey was brutal. The North Sea in the 700 seconds was not a friendly place. Freezing winds, waves taller than houses, and no GPS. The Vikings navigated by the stars, the sun, and occasionally by pure guesswork. Half the crew spent the voyage throwing up over the side, while the other half sang loudly to keep from losing their minds. When they finally spotted land, they cheered as if they had discovered paradise. It was England, or at least something that looked like it. To be honest, they didn't really check. When the Vikings first set foot on English soil, they were not impressed. The land was green, yes, but also damp, muddy, and inhabited by people who seemed terrified of everything, especially tall men with axes and poor hygiene. England in those days was divided into small kingdoms, each ruled by a local king who probably thought he was very important, but would be completely forgotten by history. Villages were simple wooden huts, a church, some cows, and a lot of people trying not to die of something preventable. So when a fleet of strange ships appeared on the horizon, the English villagers had absolutely no idea what to expect. Some thought it was the end of the world, others thought it was just the weather acting up again. But when the Vikings came charging up the beach, covered in fur, shouting in a language that sounded like someone gargling rocks, one thing became clear: it was not the mail delivery. Their first recorded landing was at Lindisfarne, a peaceful island off the northeast coast of England. It was home to a group of monks who had taken vows of silence, humility, and minding their own business. They were entirely unprepared for Vikings. Imagine spending your entire life praying, farming, and writing in Latin by candlelight, only to have a group of screaming Norsemen kick down your door asking where you keep the gold. The monks had gold and silver, mostly church ornaments, chalices, and decorative crosses. The Vikings had never seen such shiny objects before. To them, this was the jackpot. The chronicles later described the event with horror. Heathen men came, destroyed God's house, and took all they could find. But if you could have been there, it would probably have looked more like a chaotic comedy. The Vikings were rummaging through sacred relics, trying to figure out what was valuable and what was just fancy pottery. One man tried to wear a bishop's robe as a cape. Another tried to eat incense because it smelled nice. Someone rang the church bell repeatedly just because it made a cool noise. The monks, bless their hearts, tried to protest, but it's hard to reason with someone who doesn't understand your language and is currently using your Bible as a sandwich plate. When the Vikings left, they took everything shiny and several confused chickens and sailed back home, cheering like they had conquered Rome. When they returned to Norway, they were greeted as heroes. They told stories of a rich, beautiful land full of gold, cows, and people who ran away at the sight of an oar. Word spread fast. Suddenly, every Viking wanted to visit England. Not for sightseeing, for shopping, in the most violent sense of the word. Soon, fleets of longships began crossing the sea every year. Each one brought new chaos, new plunder, and a growing realization among the English that they really needed better coastal defenses. Meanwhile, the monks at Lindisfarne were writing the world's saddest diary entries. One wrote that never before had such terror come upon England. In modern terms, he basically meant, we just got absolutely wrecked. To the English, the Vikings were monsters, fire-breathing demons with horns. Though in reality, the famous horn helmets were never real. The Vikings didn't wear them. That was just medieval propaganda. The truth was stranger. The Vikings were explorers, farmers, traders, and part-time chaos enthusiasts. When they weren't raiding, they were pretty normal. They cared about family. They had laws. and they enjoyed poetry. But on that first visit, they had no idea they were making history. They just thought they'd found an easy way to get free stuff. And for a while, they were right. The first encounters between the Vikings and the English were full of confusion. The English thought the Vikings were sent by the devil. The Vikings thought the English were weak because they didn't own enough axes. Both sides looked at each other like they were seeing aliens. There were language barriers too. One Viking might shout "silver," and a terrified monk might respond with "deliver us from evil." Neither side had any idea what the other was saying, but both agreed that this was not going well. That first raid in 793 AD changed everything. It marked the beginning of the Viking Age, a period of over 2 centuries when Norsemen would travel far and wide, raiding, trading, and settling across Europe. England, once a quiet collection of kingdoms, would never be the same again. In the years that followed, the Vikings returned again and again, not just as raiders, but as settlers and rulers. Towns like York, Dublin, and even parts of London would eventually bear their influence. But the first visit, that chaotic, hilarious, terrifying landing on the shores of Lindisfarne, remains one of history's most legendary first impressions. It was a day when 2 completely different worlds collided. One armed with prayer and parchment, the other with swords and the confidence of people who definitely didn't plan ahead. And somehow, from that madness, a new chapter of European history began. News of Lindisfarne spread through Scandinavia faster than gossip in a small village. Every Viking who heard about it said the same thing. Wait, you're telling me you just showed up and people handed you gold? Within a few years, the coastlines of England were visited again, and again, and again. By the 9th century, Viking visit had basically become an annual event. The English called it terror. The Vikings called it summer vacation. At first, the English thought maybe it was a one-time thing. Then the Vikings returned the next year, and the next, and then twice in the same year. By this point, English kings were panicking. They had never dealt with anyone like the Vikings before. These were people who showed up without warning, burned your village, stole your cows, and then left before you even finished your breakfast prayer. King Ethelred of Northumbria once reportedly asked his council, "Why do they keep coming?" Someone replied, "Because they can." England had no navy, no coast guard, no warning system. The Vikings, on the other hand, had longships, sleek, fast, and terrifyingly efficient. They could sail up rivers, appear out of nowhere, and disappear just as quickly. Imagine living peacefully, minding your sheep, and suddenly a fleet of longboats appears on your river like a surprise pop-up ad. Eventually, the English kings came up with a brilliant plan to stop the raids. They decided to pay the Vikings to go away. This was called Danegeld, literally, money for the Danes. Even though not all Vikings were Danish, but nobody dared correct the king. The idea was simple. If you can't beat them, bribe them. It worked about as well as you'd expect. Every time the English paid the Vikings to leave, the Vikings said, "Thank you," and immediately told their friends. The next summer, twice as many longships showed up. Apparently, word had spread that England was offering free money for minimal violence. The Vikings started treating the English coast like a cash machine. Insert axe, receive silver. Eventually, raiding wasn't enough. Some Vikings realized that instead of sailing home after every raid, they could just stay. England had good farmland, a mild climate, and a surprising lack of people with swords. So they started building settlements. At first, small camps, then towns, then entire regions. By the mid-800s, huge parts of northern and eastern England were under Viking control. They called it the Danelaw, basically. The part we like, please don't bother us. It stretched from the north down to London, and for a while it looked like England might just become another Norse kingdom. But England wasn't finished yet. Among the endless list of panicked kings and confused monks, one man finally decided to do something about it. His name was Alfred, later known as Alfred the Great, which, given the competition, wasn't a hard title to earn. Alfred was smart. Instead of panicking, he studied the Vikings. He learned how they fought, how they moved, and most importantly, how they thought. While other kings were praying for miracles, Alfred was building fortresses, organizing militias, and secretly preparing for a comeback. When the Vikings invaded Wessex, Alfred gave them the surprise of their lives. Instead of terrified villagers running away, they found armies waiting, and those armies could actually fight back. After years of battle, Alfred managed something no one thought possible. He pushed the Vikings back. He defeated the famous Viking leader Guthrum, forced him to sign a treaty, and even had him baptized as a Christian, which, to the Vikings, was the medieval equivalent of being told to delete your old social media account and start fresh. Guthrum agreed to stay in the Danelaw, and for a while, there was peace. But this is Viking history. Peace never lasts long. After Alfred died, England entered a familiar cycle. New king, new raids. Everyone panics. Someone pays Danegeld again. Vikings laugh all the way to the fjords. By the 10th century, entire Viking armies were operating in England, not just raiders. These were professionals, fleets with banners, kings, and proper logistics. And the English, to their credit, kept rebuilding, regrouping, and somehow surviving. Then came King Ethelred the Unready, whose name says everything you need to know. He wasn't unready, as in lazy. The Old English word meant poorly advised. Basically, every time he made a decision, it was the wrong one. When faced with another Viking invasion, Ethelred panicked and paid Danegeld. Again and again and again. It got to the point where the Vikings didn't even bother raiding. They just showed up and said, "Hey, it's us again. You know the drill." Finally, in 1013, a Viking king named Sweyn Forkbeard decided to skip the middleman and just take England. He did it. He became King of England. For a few months, then he died. His son, Canute, took over and ruled both England and Denmark, creating a short-lived but impressive North Sea empire. Canute turned out to be a surprisingly good king. He kept peace, maintained laws, and even tried to prove he wasn't all-powerful by sitting on the beach and ordering the tide to stop. Spoiler, it didn't. For a while, it looked like the Vikings had finally gotten what they wanted. Not just gold or cows, but an actual kingdom. But all empires fade. After Canute's death, the Viking grip on England loosened. By 1066, the last great Viking invasion, led by Harold Hardrada, ended in disaster at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, when the English army ambushed them in a field. It was the final curtain for the Viking Age. They had come, seen, and occasionally fallen off their boats, but they had left a mark that would never fade. By the time it was over, the Vikings had changed England forever. They gave it new towns, new words, and a new attitude. Names like York, Derby, and Grimsby all came from Viking roots. Even some English words, sky, knife, husband, egg, came from Old Norse. The English language today still carries echoes of their laughter, their fury, and their unstoppable curiosity. So, what started as a few bored Norsemen wondering what was across the sea turned into one of the most influential eras in European history. They came looking for treasure and found kingdoms. They came as raiders and left as rulers. And, in true Viking fashion, they probably went home bragging about how it was all part of the plan. The English learned to fight back, the Vikings learned to settle down, and history got itself a saga so wild that people are still talking about it 1,200 years later. In the end, the story of the Vikings in England is one big, messy, hilarious lesson. Never underestimate what can happen when a few stubborn people with boats decide to just see where the water goes